and welcome to A Little Crafting. My name is Annie. This is a special life update as I was pregnant and had a baby over the last year. I wanted to just talk through a bit of that for anyone who is interested. I will go into some gory details, so if you don't fancy that, then you can pop over to the podcast episodes in the playlist and just watch those and talk about crafting, and skip this one, but I thought it was important to record this because there's so much that isn't talked about that I learnt that I feel other people should know, and yeah. Let's jump in. So I found out I was pregnant in January 2024. I think it was around the 6th. And overall my pregnancy was pretty good compared to other people that I've known. So for example, I know some people who are very, very ill for a lot of it, and I wasn't, so I'm counting myself lucky for that. I did get first trimester nausea. That was kind of annoying because it came on when I was exercising, so I felt guilty about not exercising, but then when I was exercising I was making myself feel ill. It was not great, especially as I'm a climber. I really enjoy rock climbing for both mental health and physical health. It's got a mental challenge, it's really good for switching off, so that was a bit of a shame, but luckily after about 12 to 14 weeks that passed, and then I felt great again. Like I said, I know people who've had worse. Just to jump back to before that, it did take my partner and I about 1.5 years to conceive. I am now 38, so I was considered, I guess, older for getting pregnant in the first place. And I did speak to a GP when we started our journey to kind of find out what we should and shouldn't do, if there was anything that they could recommend, especially because I had my own worries about pregnancy, considering my mum had preeclampsia and I was born 3 months early. So I really wanted to alleviate some fears about that. One of the reasons that we didn't try earlier was actually because my mum had that, and I was very anxious about being pregnant and something happening to the baby and all of that kind of thing. But actually overall, now that I've done it, everything was fine. So they were anxieties that were exacerbated by the fact that I had known about my mum's experience, and therefore pregnancy just scared me as an idea, even though I did want to have kids. So yeah, eventually have obviously gotten over that, and gone ahead to try and successfully have a baby, which I know for some people is also very difficult and not possible. So I do feel for those of us who are not managing to have a child when they really want one. So yes, jumping back to actually being pregnant, I did that in slightly the wrong order. So cravings, lots of people always ask about cravings. My very specific craving was bacon in a baguette. So like a bacon sandwich in a baguette. I'm half French, so obviously that's where the baguette side comes from, but that was kind of funny, me sending my husband off to go and get bacon every day, and bread, so that we could have a bacon sandwich. That again also didn't last long, so similar to the nausea. I also really craved cheese for a while, much to the dismay of my craft group and one particular member of my craft group who I sent out to buy cheese and then didn't eat. Yeah, that was funny. Apologies for that. And yeah, in terms of what helps the nausea, things like ginger beer, eating Ritz crackers kind of helped. I also got the travel sickness bands, which may have helped a bit, but overall it was just not moving too much. That seemed to do the trick. It basically just felt like being travel sick, but without the full movement, like just from you moving, if you see what I mean. It was really bizarre. Don't recommend that feeling, but overall it's worth it in the end, right? You just have to go through a little bit of that to begin with. And that's all just hormones that are going on and changing in your body that are causing things like that. Aversions, again, I didn't have many. I had one incident where I had baked some aubergine and courgette, and I was going to have it with some bulgur wheat just for a dinner. I think my husband was out, and the thought of it just made me feel unwell, and I forced myself to eat it, which was a really bad idea. Then I was really unwell. I actually had to take a day off work sick because of it. So first bit of advice, if the thought of something doesn't make you feel like very well, don't go and eat it. Just have pizza or something else that you don't feel sick thinking about. Order in instead. Yeah, I thought, oh no, I should eat this, it's healthy, it's vegetables, I shouldn't order something else and then paid for it the next day. Generally, yeah, the other little blips that I had, just the hormones being up and down, being incredibly emotional. I'm generally quite a logical, straight thinking kind of person, and there were a couple of weeks with work that I just started off the week emotional and it just carried on all the way through, and it wasn't logical at all, and I took everything to heart. But that's just something, again, you have to go, okay, no, this isn't me normally, this is just the hormones again. And once you kind of link 2 and 2 together, you go, okay, actually that's much easier to manage, because people understand as well, especially if you've told them that you're pregnant. People understand, they go, oh yeah, okay, we can kind of forgive you for that unusual behaviour. Which is nice. And then I also had hypothyroidism, which is an underactive thyroid. Again, I was only tested because my mum has it, and it seems to have only lasted during the pregnancy, so I've only had to be on medication during the pregnancy, which is quite nice. And yeah, what else happened? So throughout first and second trimester, all good, and then at week 34 I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes. This was probably the most stressful thing I went through during pregnancy. So just to give you a bit of explanation, this is effectively you become diabetic because your placenta and I think it's the pancreas that produces insulin. So your hormones are kind of in overdrive, your placenta kind of pulls lots into to kind of make your baby grow, and then your body can't help you as much in dealing with things like this. So I wasn't producing enough insulin, so I wasn't breaking down sugars as well, which meant that I had high blood sugar and therefore I had gestational diabetes. That just went away after pregnancy. So gestational diabetes comes with some complications, I guess, in a way. Luckily not so much for me. At the appointment they give you a little pack. You have to check your blood sugar before you eat a meal and then an hour afterwards. So you have to prick your finger, and you have this little machine that you tap the blood onto, and it gives you a reading that links to an app in your phone, and it all gets tracked And the idea is that if you're in the green, you're good. If it's red, then you're too high. And I spoke to a dietitian. That was really helpful. So I ended up managing it all with diet, which a lot of people can't. So what was really useful to know was if you eat more protein along with carbs and sugars, it helps your body break it down more easily. So my breakfast was the worst offender because I tended to have toast with butter and something else on it. So I thought, you know, granary bread or sourdough would be fine, but that still didn't really work. So what I had to do was I had toast and eggs. Or I had 1 slice of toast and 2 eggs. So lots of protein with a bit of carb and fibre. And that seems to set it up really well for the rest of the day. What was tricky was like going out and having to do the testing. So finding myself pricking my finger in a restaurant to then do the test just felt really weird. Also having to time it an hour after a meal, having to do the test again. The first few days were really stressful because I hadn't got the hang of doing it properly. So for example, I would prick my finger, try and do the test, and it would fail, and I'd have to do it again and again, and then I was worried about running out of test strips and needles and all of that, and it generally became like quite stressful. Once I'd realised I could just order extra stuff on Amazon to be delivered next day, and I had enough supply for a long time, I felt much better because I wasn't then worried about using too much. That was all fine. The other thing, the other thing to talk about with gestational diabetes is that when you have gestational diabetes, they tend to recommend that you are induced. So that means, so induction is effectively them starting off your labour artificially, earlier than your due date usually for gestational diabetes. But I was lucky in that I was managing it with diet. Other people are unable to manage it with diet because of the way that their body is operating and the way that the kind of placenta is pulling away their essential nutrients. They would have to go on a drug called metformin, and then if it's worse than that, actually inject insulin. Metformin means that the healthcare professionals will want to induce, I think, a week 38. So that's 2 weeks before your due date. Luckily, I didn't have to do that because I was diet controlled. And I was really pleased that I managed to do that, because out of every single thing in terms of labour and pain meds and everything, the one thing that I did not want was to be induced. I wanted to go into labour naturally, because there are a lot of things that happen with induction that make it more painful and make you more likely to have a C-section or a really traumatic birth. So that was, yeah, that was that was good. I didn't have to get induced. I did actually have an induction booked in week 41, but if that had come around, I think the lady who ran my NCT group was really helpful in suggesting that if you don't want it, you just call them up and rebook it for another day, and delay it if you don't feel like it. Another thing, NCT was absolutely fantastic. I think the main thing that I learned was that it was always my choice. So whatever they say or suggest, unless it's an absolute medical emergency, it's always your choice. You can say no to what the doctors recommend, and that made it feel like I was more in control in general, especially in terms of labour. So yeah, pregnancy overall really went well. I didn't feel too tired, a bit tired, but I managed work absolutely fine. It was usually just in the evenings I would not have as much energy to do things like crafting, unfortunately. And then yeah, I was on the high risk pathway for a number of reasons. So I had a lot of scans, which was actually quite reassuring. I knew that my baby was fine. Lots of scans, and then with the gestational diabetes you also got quite a few at the end, which was quite nice. Again, quite reassuring to know that everything was fine, and also see a baby's heartbeat and all of that. So yeah, pregnancy, all good, thumbs up, went really well, especially considering I had those anxieties already about going through that. So, labour and birth. Like I said, what I really didn't want was an induction. I know people who've had really bad experiences where inductions haven't really worked, or they've taken a week to work, or almost a week to work. And in that time they've been in a lot of pain, and had to be in hospital the whole time. There's also a statistic, I think it's just for my hospital, that 50% of inductions end in a C-section anyway. So that's a really high percentage. And yeah, effectively it's forcing your body to go into labour when it's not ready. So I think it's the baby that actually releases a hormone that starts labour off. But what happens with an induction is that they artificially open your cervix with like a catheter type thing, and then also there's the possibility of injecting artificial oxytocin, which is the thing that keeps labour going, into your blood. So that's how induction works. Yeah, generally it has a longer, more painful labour, and then, like I said, 50% end in a C-section anyway. So I did ask one of my my friends from NCT at what point could she just have actually just given me a C-section, because she had a really traumatic labour that ended in a C-section anyway as well, and she was induced. So yeah, so I was really lucky that I could manage my diabetes with diet, which meant that when I spoke to the doctors and said I don't want an induction, they were happy with that. If I had been on metformin, they would not have been happy with that, because it impacts the baby in some way, I think. Essentially, when your baby's born, they'll have a sugar drop, and they don't want the baby to stay pulling from you for too long, because they'll have high sugar, and then when they're born they'll have a lack of sugar, because they're so used to a high sugar diet. I think it's something along those lines. Again, I am not a medical professional, I'm just telling you what I've understood from my experience. I did have one incredibly hard conversation over the phone with a diabetes doctor. So this is after an initial agreement with one doctor that we wouldn't even talk about induction until week 41. She was really pushing me to book an induction, and was bringing up things like stillbirth and increased chances of that. Now, I know the statistics on stillbirth. Again, not a medical professional, but I'm a data person. That's my job, is data. And when someone tries to guilt you into something you don't want, because they say something like, oh, the risks of stillbirth double, that is not a statistically accurate way of explaining the data. But that's what she said on the phone, is, you know, if you wait, the risks of stillbirth will double, which sounds horrific, right? When you hear that, it's horrific. They should not be saying that. The actual data, or at least the data that I've seen, this is from the NCT classes. Again, I'm not a health professional, but if I'd needed to, I'd have talked through this with a doctor, is that it does double, but it's from a really, really low base. So you're talking like, I can't remember exactly, but something like 0.5% to 1% chance So it might be doubling, but the likelihood is still incredibly low. So doubling is not, you know, 25 to 50%. It's something like 0.5 to 1% or 1% to 2%. You should be able to look up those stats online if you want to. So I had that really uncomfortable experience. She ended up booking me in for an induction in week 41 that I would have just, if I'd got to week 41, I'd have called up and cancelled, because I really didn't want that. And so long as my baby was safe and doing well, I didn't see a reason to. But that really upset me, that conversation, and the way that they approached that. And I absolutely love the NHS, and 90% of people that we dealt with were amazing. But I guess there's the odd one where they think they know what's best for you and they're trying to push you towards an outcome that you don't want, which I don't like. But some people are not as knowledgeable, of course. What I really wanted from labour was a water birth in a birthing centre with just gas and air, and I got that, which is amazing, because it's, speaking to the midwives in the birthing centre, hardly anyone gets to the point where they actually have the birth that they want, and I was really lucky. Just knowing people that I know who were planning birthing centre births ended up in a hospital, C-sections, etc. You know, I'm counting myself lucky that I got that experience, and it was a really nice experience and I was really happy. Birthing centre rooms where I had my baby are lovely. They're like 5-star. You get a double bed, you've got twinkly lights, you've got all of the pain relief kind of balls and all sorts of things that you could want. You've got a birthing pool. The one thing that they couldn't do is they can't give you an epidural in that birthing centre. So that was off the cards unless I moved to a labour ward. The hospital was right next door, so it wasn't too bad if I didn't need that or want that. But overall I managed to give birth without, which is amazing. So what I found useful was making sure that the water in the birthing pool was high enough that it covered my back as well as my front, finding a comfortable position, and also with the gas and air, what I found really helpful was not just the gas and air, it was also the breathing that you had to do to inhale and exhale, which one of the midwives explained to me. They were like, you need to breathe in and then take it off and breathe out. Breathe in, take it off, breathe out. And because I had that kind of rhythm, that really helped me concentrate on that rather than the contractions. So what happened exactly? So 2 AM Thursday before my due date, I started having contractions. They felt like what I would call bad period pains. I called the birthing centre and spoke to them and said I was managing okay. And I would call back later if I felt I needed to go in. What you have is a latent phase of labour, which can last quite a while, where you have contractions but they're on and off, they're not consistent, and they fade away after a bit and come back later. The contractions continued, started getting stronger on the 15th, which was my due date. Funnily enough, that was 2 AM on the 15th, so a few days exactly after they started. But yeah, they'd kind of gone away and come back over the weekend, and then on the Sunday morning, bam, started again. We went into the birthing centre, played cards, but they slowed down and stopped at 10 AM. So I spoke to the midwife about it. She said, they could check how dilated I was and things like that if I wanted to know, and I said to her no, I'd prefer not to, because it would probably make me more stressed if I wasn't very dilated, or even if I was quite dilated. So I went home after 10 a.m. And then the rest of the day we watched the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, hung around on the sofa, contractions carried on and off, and then at 7 p.m. my waters broke at home. So we called the birthing centre again, went back in, and they confirmed I was in active labour and went back to the room I had before. I was given some codeine, and then after about 10 minutes I asked them to fill up the bath for me. And then gas and air, and then all the way through until 3:20 a.m. on the 16th of September, my daughter was born. And that was 3 and a bit hours just past her due date. Some things that I didn't know before the NCT classes: you have to birth the placenta as well. It doesn't just come out with the baby. So there's a process after the baby is born. And it did take a while for me. I didn't want, you can kind of have a drug which forces it to happen, but I didn't really want that. I was like, what's the rush? So yeah, so that takes a little while afterwards. And then I had my beautiful baby born in the birthing pool and in my arms, and then got checked over. So a few wins were I had the birth experience I wanted, absolutely everything, no cervical dilation checks at all. I've heard from other people that they actually found those checks more painful than contractions, so I'm glad I didn't have to go through that. The midwives were fantastic in making sure that I knew it was my choice to do that or not. They kept asking me, you know, it's totally your choice, we can do that if you want information, or we don't have to. And then of course our beautiful baby daughter at the end of it all was the biggest win. A few misses. So whilst everything went amazingly in terms of being able to have the majority of the birth experience I wanted, I did get a bit excited. So as soon as the midwife said, oh, her head's through, I pushed really hard, and learning from the NCT classes that you don't have to do that, that your body just kind of does it gradually, didn't cross my mind. So I really pushed hard at the end, and I shouldn't have done. I think that was the reason I ended up with what's called a 3rd degree tear, and I had to go into theatre for stitches for that because it was quite bad. And it did mean a longer recovery as well, which is still not quite there yet, 4 months later. Another thing that happened was that my husband was giving me a lot of water whilst I was in labour, and I didn't go to the toilet from the point that I started active labour until well after my daughter was born. The midwives should probably have been keeping track, but I didn't realise at all. Like, I wasn't thinking about anything like that. I was focusing on contractions and breathing and all of that stuff that you have to do. So I did end up putting my bladder into shock, and had to have a catheter for 2 weeks, which was really, really irritating when you're trying to manage like tubes and stuff, as well as picking up and putting down a baby, feeding them, etc. That was, I would say, more annoying than the tear. Those things meant that I ended up in the postnatal ward for recovery instead of in the birthing centre with the lovely private room and the double bed and all of that, which is a shame because that experience would have made it so much better. That meant being in a ward which was busy, loud, nurses weren't as attentive. My husband had to go home overnight, he couldn't stay in, whereas he could have done in the birthing centre. And if I hadn't had the tear, I could have stayed in the birthing centre. So yeah, that's kind of labour. So let's move on to postnatal recovery and caring for a newborn. So another thing I didn't know before getting pregnant is that you bleed for up to 6 weeks afterwards whilst you heal. However, it is not as bad as it sounds. It's basically a bit of a period for the start, and then it lightens off and comes and goes for the rest of the time. So it was actually quite manageable. Straight after, I'd obviously been in theatre and had a spinal anaesthetic because of the tear. So that meant I was pretty out of it for a lot of the experience in hospital. A lot of the time I had to ask my husband to write everything down and manage conversations with doctors because I couldn't take any information in. It just went in and out. My brain was not functioning. Overall, I did feed my baby pretty soon after birth, and that was absolutely fine. I also had harvested a lot of colostrum beforehand. That's breast milk that starts being produced before birth and has a high fat content. They recommend that you do this especially for gestational diabetes, but also in general anyway. It is definitely worth doing. I ran out pretty fast in the hospital and had to do it in the hospital itself when I was there. I really felt on my own overnight that evening. Midwives were there to help, but the lights were off. I was trying to feed my baby, change nappies, harvest colostrum in almost complete darkness. No one had actually told me there was a light above the bed that I could turn on. So I was using my phone light and really just got on with it. But there were, you know, mothers crying, babies crying, and I really didn't sleep. My daughter sometimes breastfed successfully, other times not. But my husband had spoken with the midwives and agreed that we would be able to go home the day after, once we'd had a few checks. And I really didn't want to spend another night there because I knew I wouldn't sleep. It felt so much better being home. My husband had a migraine the next day, which was really annoying, but my parents came over to help, and feeding worked sometimes, so I carried on harvesting the colostrum and had a manual hand pump to use to try and get the milk going. Day 2 we had a visit from the midwife, so that was the day after we came home. My daughter was slightly jaundiced, so a bit orange, and the midwife organised for someone to come and check the next day. Day 3 I felt so proud of myself because I pumped 16 millilitres in the morning. The support worker came around later and my daughter's jaundice had got worse. She also weighed her and she'd lost 13% of her body weight since birth. And I think they send you into hospital if it's over 10%. So it turns out that 16 ml that I was really proud of in the morning was really not enough for her. On day 3, apparently you should have 50 millilitres per feed, which again was something that I didn't know, something that I feel they should have told us on discharge. We weren't told before we left the hospital, and she still wasn't breastfeeding properly. So we went into hospital. That day, literally the worst day of my life, to find out that I hadn't been feeding my daughter enough, especially when you're so emotional. She was dehydrated, but the jaundice wasn't as bad as they thought, so she didn't need the treatment for that. And we were given a feeding plan that consisted of breastfeeding, pumping, feeding her the pump milk, and then also topping up with formula until I was producing enough to feed her properly. We got our own room this time, and by the next afternoon she was back on track, which was great. Everyone was absolutely amazing and managed to improve the feeding with a nipple shield, which is an option. It's just like an extra little plastic thing that you can add to a breast to help a baby latch, and that's what was happening with my daughter. She was just not latching properly at all. We kept on that feeding plan for the next 3 weeks, but I have now been able to feed her breast milk exclusively. That's between breastfeeding and pumping, which is great. And she's now able to feed without the nipple shield, which is amazing. So that's at, yeah, she's now 4 months old. Those were the toughest days of my life, honestly. There's something about being a new mum and being told you're doing great but you're not feeding your baby properly. It was just absolutely heartbreaking. I felt like I'd completely failed. And yeah, I think it just helps to be more informed about what the amounts are that you need to, because I was still feeding her bits of colostrum, pumped breast milk, etc. When she wasn't able to latch, I needed to know how much was good enough. And yeah, that was a real downer that day, but we got back on track. Those first 2 weeks were so incredibly hard. They were the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, but the best thing that I did was go to a local feeding clinic support group, and it was run by a feeding specialist from the hospital. I would not be breastfeeding without her. Literally absolutely amazing. Showed me the right technique, showed me different positions I could use that would work better, and I went twice 1 week and then every week following for a few weeks. My life-saving product, which I sent my parents to go and buy as I was discharged from the hospital with my daughter, was my LV Stride breast pump. That is the best £225 I have ever spent. It's powerful because it still has a motor, like an external motor, but it sits comfortably in my bra. I can pump whilst walking around the supermarket. I can pump whilst I'm cleaning the house. I don't have to be like the hospital ones, sat connected to a machine holding the breast pump on. I can even sleep a bit with it on, obviously propped up in bed so that I'm not lying back, but yeah, during a night feed that's really handy, or after a night feed that's really handy. Thankfully sleeping hasn't really been an issue for my daughter. She drifts off easily in her crib normally, except the last few days where she's going through a bit of a growth spurt, what's called a 4-month regression, because she's learning lots of new skills, including how to roll. So yeah, so thankfully that's been going well. She has been mostly sleeping through 7 to 8 hours at night as well, which is amazing because it means we get lots of sleep. Smiles and laughter happened quite early, and she's really engaged with everything, so it's just so fun to watch her. She loves people's faces, in particular lady doctors that she has to see, especially with the glasses. They make her laugh. She chats absolutely all the time and is just a really happy baby despite all the struggles that we had in the first 2 weeks. I think I was really lucky to have encountered midwives and feeding specialists at the right time, because without them I would have given up and I'd just be feeding her formula. Something I kept telling myself throughout the hard times was, this is really hard, it seems like we'll never get through it, but I felt like this before and I've succeeded, so why should that be different this time? And I can do it. That really kept me going. I think if I let myself spiral further and not pulled myself back out again, I wouldn't be breastfeeding. I'd have just gone, no, I'm done, I'm just feeding her formula. And breastfeeding is both more practical but also more about connection, and in terms of scientifically, so this is just stuff that I've read, it really helps with their immune system in the short term. So for example, I had norovirus over Christmas. Because I was breastfeeding my daughter, she got all of the antibodies from that. Equally, she's had a cold this last week, and because she's had a cold, my body's been producing the antibodies that help her fight that cold. that wouldn't happen with formula. So I think that's one of the few things that's scientifically correct in terms of all the stories you hear about breastfeeding. But yeah, it's also that connection. It doesn't cost you anything, and it's lots less sterilising and drying of stuff, because you don't have to sterilise bottles constantly. But yeah, again, counting myself lucky that the feeding issue was spotted early and not later on when it was going to be much harder to deal with. The other thing I wanted to talk about is loss of identity as a new mother. With the recovery and the feeding schedule, cluster feeding, 2 to 3 hours prep it takes to leave the house, I felt for a long time that I couldn't do anything else other than care for my baby, or be anything else other than a mother. Your hormones when you're going through that period are of course a huge factor, combined with a massive sudden change, and you think, oh, you should be prepared for this. It's been, you know, maybe 8 months since you knew you were pregnant, but nothing prepares you for that, and it feels so sudden, that sudden shift from, especially because I only had a week of maternity leave before I gave birth. You go from working as normal, doing your hobbies as normal, to suddenly your whole world is caring for this baby. It's looking after this baby. Nothing else matters anymore. And it's huge in that change. That shift is massive. And one weekend day when my daughter was cluster feeding for 7 hours, my husband was sitting next to me the whole time getting annoyed at a video game. That kind of broke me. I didn't feel like I could move or do anything that day. The house was still a mess. The stress built up and up. We talked and we had to just figure out a way of making things work better. And I've now worked out that I can knit small projects whilst I'm breastfeeding, which makes me feel like I'm being productive even when I'm just sitting there, which of course I am, but I'm not doing anything for myself. And my husband does ask a lot if there's anything that I had on my list to do today, and he'll go and do those things to make sure that I don't feel stressed about them. Things have got so much easier. We're now in a rhythm, we're going out all the time. I'm trying not to let having a small baby daughter, stop me from doing the things that I want to. So if I need to, I will just take her with me and we can manage. And yeah, everything's going so well. She's developing really well. I'm super paranoid about her losing weight ever again. We did have a bit of a blip after her first vaccines. The rotavirus one gave her diarrhea for 10 days and she lost weight, and the midwives, or sorry, the health visitors who I was talking to about it just said, don't worry, she's had diarrhea, come back next week, we'll weigh her. My immediate reaction was the same as it had been before. Oh my god, I'm failing. Okay, how do I make this right again? But it was nothing to do with me, and it was nothing to do with her. It was just unfortunate that she'd had such a bad reaction, and lost weight because of that. The week after, absolutely fine. She'd gained like 600 grams in that week and was pretty much back on track. So it was okay, which I'm really happy about. And she's just a lovely baby. I know, again, I'm very lucky to have a baby that sleeps, and a baby that doesn't cry very much, and a baby that laughs and smiles all the time. So there's a lot of luck involved. I think I've heard of all sorts of challenges from other people, babies crying all the time with colic, nothing they can do about it. You know, so again, counting myself lucky. Yeah, and I think that is what I'll conclude with. The next thing we need to tackle is daytime naps, because they're not really planned. She just sleeps on and off occasionally, especially after breastfeeding. and we need to get her into a schedule probably. So that's on my list to think about when we get a chance to really start putting a schedule in place. But yeah, otherwise I am now loving it. For any new mothers watching this, lots of people say it will get better. It really does. Like that, it does. First 2 weeks, absolute nightmare, horrible. You're just going through absolutely everything. Hormones, recovery, learning new skills, trying to get a baby to learn new skills, and it's just chaos. And then over time, it calms down, it pans out, and you get into the rhythm, you get into the routine, you're used to doing everything you need to do, and it's all working. And I can record as well, which is great, and do crafts. Yeah, that is where I will end. Again, this is just my experience. I just wanted to relay that again, and say thank you very much for listening. My experience, other people will have different experiences, but those are the things that I have learned throughout all of this. And I'm really pleased to be a mother. I'm absolutely loving it now, and I couldn't be happier with my baby daughter. So let's see what the next few years bring. She could be a nightmare as a toddler or as a teenager. So we'll see what happens there. But for now, it's going really well. Thanks for watching. I will get back to my usual podcast very soon. Bye.